What's up, Frog Fanatics? Hope you're all having an awesome morning, evening, or afternoon, whatever time it is, wherever you're at in the world. So we did a video kind of like this before RC Charlotte back in March or whatever month that was. And since we've got RC Houston coming up, I thought I would do a little bit of an updated version with the new modern metagame. So what I'm going to do is I'm taking the top 15 or so archetypes in modern, all according to MTG Goldfish, and we're going to go down the row, deck by deck, and we're going to discuss things to look for in an open deck list environment. And I'm going to give sideboarding advice, so things that might help you out with your sideboarding decisions. Now, this is all based off of the Dimir Frogtide shell, Dimir Riddler shell, stuff like that. But I'm sure that there's going to be a decent amount of carryover for like the Esper Blink players, the Esper Goryo's Vengeance players. So if you play a blue black X mid range slash frog deck in modern, then this probably will have some useful information for you. But let's go ahead and get started. We're just going to go deck by deck. You'll kind of see how this goes with Goryo's. And then down below in the description, I'll have my most recent deck list, my recent trophy list, as well as timestamps for all the different matchups. But this is going to be more of like a long form kind of rant video. It's not going to be a specific stopping point scripted style take. So if you're flying, you want to download this ahead of time, or you want to listen to it in the car on your way to Houston, that's probably what I would recommend. It's not going to be the most thrilling to watch, but maybe it'll give you some useful information in the background. Anyway, let's go ahead and get started. Number one, we got Goryo's Vengeance, Esper Goryo's. Things to look for in an open deck list tournament, like what's coming up in Houston. From the Dimir perspective, if my opponent is playing Teferi Time Reveler in the main deck, that's a card to be aware of. It's a card that if it resolves, we have a very, very low chance of beating. We just don't pressure planeswalkers very well, especially if it's like a extremely tempo negative planeswalker like Teferi that resets our limited clock plus turns all of our counter spells into like dead pieces of cardboard. So watching out for Teferi. I'm keeping an eye out for things like the number of prismatic endings, because that might dictate how aggressive I am at jamming a threat down early on if I don't have counter backup right there. I'm looking for the priest, the black white 5 mana, unearth it, and then reanimate something else priest. Keeping an eye on if that card is present, because I do want to know if there's a chance my opponent can like discard one of those into turn to a frog, untap, get around counter magic with a reanimate effect. Now, when I mention a lot of these one-ofs, there's going to be plenty of situations where you can't necessarily play around them, but if you can play your game in a way that makes playing around them free, I would advise it. So for example, if you play something like main deck Cling to Dust and you notice that your opponent is on the reanimate creature and you don't have to use that Cling to Dust, it might be worth holding on to just in the off chance that they do find that creature and you need to be able to interact without a counter spell, as long as it doesn't disrupt the rest of your game plan. So keeping an eye on Teferis, keeping an eye on the number of prismatic endings, the reanimate creature. As far as sideboarding goes, definitely expecting them to bring in like all these mystical disputes. Being able to set up a Bowmaster into Kaito is extremely strong. You do have to recognize that they typically play a breeding pool or a hedge maze, so they can prismatic ending Kaito. But for the most part, that's like one of the threats we have that's very difficult for them to interact with. It's very easy for Kaito to run away with the game. It also pressures things like Teferi Time Reveler out of the board extremely well. The Quantum Riddler plan post board for them can be extremely good if they're able to Riddler Ephemerate. So trying to keep a hand that's got an answer to a warped Riddler, like a Strategic Betrayal, Shieldred's Edict, Shoot the Sheriff, something like that, can be very, very beneficial. Mystical Dispute, I think, is arguably the best card we have post board against them. Being able to answer a Psychic Frog on turn 2, because you want to counter the frog instead of using a removal spell on it if you can, so that they can't discard an Atraxa in response to the removal spell. So Mystical Dispute, being able to counter Frog, Quantum Riddler, Warp, Teferi is all extraordinarily relevant, as well as help fight over your opponent's Mystical Disputes that they're likely bringing in. So fighting over Teferi, fighting over Frog, Quantum Riddler on the stack, keeping note of the amount of interaction your opponent actually has available to them. Things like Stern Scolding post board, really, really good. Fight over Frog, fight over Solitude, Emperor of Bones if they got it. Board outs, Force of Negation gets a little bit more awkward post board because Mystical Dispute is like a really, really efficient answer to Force of Negation. So if they go for a spell, you force, and they can counter back for 1 mana, and you just lost like the force and the card you pitched, it can be pretty backbreaking. Cards like Flusterstorm are really, really good into Goryos. It's kind of like Veil of Summer in that I get to counter your thing and you don't get to counter back. The stack's just kind of over at that point. Surgical Extraction, Nihil Spellbomb are both fine. You do have to keep in mind that Goryos can transition to this really good mid-range deck post board, but they're always going to have a significant number of cards that are at risk of being dead if you take the graveyard per se out of the equation. So if you're able to get rid of the Atraxas or get rid of the Goryos target, then you have the potential of making like future Atraxas and future Goryos and stuff like that dead. So keeping an eye on the graveyard, but be a little bit more concerned with the mid-range plan post board. That's Goryos down. Next up, we've got Boros Energy. Giving myself little signals so I know in editing where to make my transition scenes. Boros Energy. The big things to keep an eye on game 1 is the number of static prisons your opponent has access to. We've seen some lists going down to like 1 in the 75. I've seen some people playing up to 3. I haven't seen 4 in a minute, not since the One Ring was legal, but 1 to 2 static prisons is usually pretty normal. So it's likely not going to be a card that you should statistically play around game 1. But again, kind of like against Goryos with Cling to Dust, if you have the chance to play around it, I would. So for example, if you've got a threat, you've got a Force of Negation, and your opponent plays a Goblin Bombardment that doesn't matter, like let's say you've tapped out for your Murktide Regent, you've passed, they cast a Goblin Bombardment, they have a Guide of Souls on board, nothing else. It might be worth ignoring that Goblin Bombardment to try to hold Force Negation for potential follow-up static prison. Obviously, you have to take into account, like, what have you seen so far? Is it likely they have it in hand? But just if you can freely play around it, then I would advise doing so. The threat package from Boros Energy is very, very consistent at this point. Like 2 Voice of Victory is about the only flex option. Some lists playing voice, some not, but 4 Guide, 4 Ocelot, 4 Ragavan, 4 Johnny, 4 Flage, all pretty stock. You might see like a 2-2 split of Seasoned Pyromancer and Fable of the Mirror Breaker, but kind of nitpicking at that point. Out of the sideboard, open deck list, I'm looking for things like Blood Moon in the main deck. I have run into some Boros with Blood Moon in the main recently, so being aware that that's a potential possibility. Either if you have the chance to fetch kind of freely early on, going ahead and getting a couple basics can be really beneficial. Or if you don't have to use your force negation or counterspell or something on something else, then it might be worth not to. Like, there's plenty of late games where I've got a Murktide out or a Frog out, and my opponent plays a Guide of Souls, and I have a counterspell, but it's worth just letting that Guide of Souls resolve and saving the counterspell for the next thing. If it's a follow-up Ocelot Pride, or if it's a Seasoned Pyromancer, Blood Moon, whatever the case may be. So just keeping an idea of, is this thing that they're playing right now actually going to end the game for them, or is this just kind of delaying the inevitable? Post board. If you're on a Murktide build, you might want to keep an eye on things like Ghost Vacuum post board. So if they've got a more extensive amount of grave hate, it might be worth like boarding down a little bit on your grave dependent cards. But usually you're not going to be boarding out Murktide or like Psychic Frog in the matchup. Surgical Extraction, you don't really care about. Celestial Purge, you do need to be aware of. Makes things like Tamiyo a little bit better. Makes Frog obviously a little bit worse. Murktide, really great post board. You don't care about Wrath of Skies. Clarion Conqueror, they could technically bring in, but I think it shuts off more of their good plays than ours, since they can't use a flip to Johnny with a Clarion Conqueror out. That's kind of a big deal. So I wouldn't really expect that one. Something like Enduring Innocence out of this board would be a card that I want to make sure I can interact with, because I don't want my opponent going like Enduring Innocence, Ocelot Pride, and being able to draw some cards. So fighting over that. I don't think there's much else the way of really frustrating Boros cards. Like, you've all played against Boros 1,000 times at this point. Yeah, here's like main deck Blood Moon. It's just about trying to limit the early game pressure, recognizing if your opponent's got like Arena of Glory out. But you kind of know this matchup by now. Let's move on. Number 3 is Tameshi Belcher, or just mono blue Belcher. The big thing pre-board to look out for is, are they on Flare of Denial? I think it's fairly stock at this point, but every now and then I'll run into a list that is not on Flare of Denial. And then keeping an eye on the count of things like Stern Scolding, Strict Serenade in this point, or Spell Snare, so that I know how feasible it is to jam a Frog or a Frog or a Tamiyo or a Murktide early game. So for example, if my opponent is on Stern Scolding and Spell Snare and no Strict Serenade, I know Murktide's going to be safer to resolve, especially if they don't have a creature on board to be able to flare, because it gets around most counter spells they have access to. If they are on a bunch of Strict Serenade, it might be a little more risky. I might want to like jam my 1 or 2 drop threat first to try to set up for getting Murktide down. The creatures on their side, I do highly recommend countering like Philology Archaeologist, Thundertrap Trainer if you can. The real, like, not only are these creatures a redraw, but they enable Flare of Denial. So if you're able to counter them, you stop the draw, and you create scenarios where Flare of Denial is just a dead piece of cardboard in hand. Pre-game, Tamiyo, Psychic Frog are like your best cards by a mile. You want the card advantage. You need to be able to win the counter war in the crucial turns, which is going to happen. There's going to be a counter war. somewhere between like turn 4 and 6. And if you win that, there's a very good chance you'll be able to steal the game. If you don't win that, you're going to have a very difficult time catching back up. Don't underestimate hard cast Char Belcher. Like your opponent just saying, here's a Char Belcher. It's a real thing. You need to be ready for that. You need to be able to react. Post board. The big things to keep an eye out for are Tamiyo out of the board. Can be really difficult. You typically aren't boarding out that much spot removal because you need it to fight over the creatures to stop flare of denial. So it's not something you can't typically deal with. But Tamiyo out of the board is very solid. Cards like Into the Flood Maw to be able to bounce a Murktide are good to know about. Flusterstorm's good to know about. Tezzeret, I think, is kind of stock in most lists now, so you know that's coming. This is another matchup where like Mystical Dispute really shines. Flusterstorm really shines. Consigned to Memory out of our side is pretty good. But it's just about being the person that lands a card advantage engine, like stopping their Tamiyo, getting your own Tamiyo rolling, and you should be okay for the most part. I would keep an eye on your hand. If you have like a creature attacking with a Kaito in hand, and you're able to ninjutsu it before your opponent has 3 untapped mana, I would absolutely do it. The reason for that is if you're like, say I'm on the play, I'm attacking in, they've got 2 lands, I can ninjutsu a Kaito. Getting that Kaito down is such a faster clock while keeping the card advantage going. And if you do it before they have 3 mana available, then you have the chance of like force negationing a Whir of Invention as soon as they get the 3 mana, because they could just go for it on their turn or they could go for it on your turn. Either way, you should have interaction at that point. But if you wait until they have more mana available, you run the risk of ninjutsuing Kaito, and then they like Whir on your end step. You don't have the mana available to fight over it because you just spent a bunch ninjutsuing, and then they get to untap and have a very explosive turn. So timing on Kaito, keeping an eye on what counter spells they have available post board, and what kind of like card advantage engines they're bringing in, and just kind of focus a bit on those. Lotus Bloom on suspend. If you don't know this interaction, when your opponent has got a Lotus Bloom suspended, there's 2 triggers that are created. The first trigger is, or the last turn that your opponent goes to remove their last time counter, there's 2 triggers that are created. They remove a time counter, or there's a trigger to resolve the removal of the time counter. And then once the time counter is removed, there's a trigger that says, all right, now you get to decide if you want to cast this spell. If you consign the second trigger specifically, then the Lotus Bloom stays in exile with 0 counters on it, and it cannot be cast from exile at that point. It's because of the wording on suspend. You can cast the card when the last time counter is removed. If you don't have a time counter on it, you can't remove a time counter from it. Therefore, you cannot cast it when the last counter is removed. So if you're able to like replicate a consign on that second Lotus Bloom trigger, make sure that you do. And I would try to verbalize with your opponent, if you have consign and they have a Lotus Bloom, that you want to consign the second trigger, because I'm sure there's going to be some players out there that got because their opponent's going to say like trigger and with the Lotus Bloom, and someone's going to go to consign it, and all they're going to do is not remove the time counter, because the first trigger is to remove the time counter. And if you counter that one, then they get to go to their next turn and remove it again and then cast it. So you have to make sure that last counter is removed and then you counter the subsequent trigger. Hopefully that helps out with the Belcher matchup a little bit. Keeping Tameshi off the board is kind of like priority number one. So if you've got an extra counter, Stern Scolding, Spell Snare, or something sitting around, try to save it for Tameshi. All right, so number four is Affinity. This is hands down the matchup that I am the most apprehensive about, like by a mile. I think unless you're blue-white control with like Wrath the Skies and Supreme Verdicts and stuff like that, this is going to be a very, very rough matchup. It's not unwinnable, but you do have to be very, very disciplined with like your mulligan decisions. So pre-board is almost not worth thinking about, because if they just have any sort of normal Pinnacle Emissary start, there's not going to be a lot you can do about. But what I do want to do is focus on mulligan decisions. So I want to make sure I'm keeping a hand that's got a way to interact with like a payoff from them, whether it be a Kappa Cannoneer, Thought Monitor, to a lesser extent, a Pinnacle Emissary. Like if I'm on the play, hands with Fetch Land, Fatal Push are a lot more enticing, because they can warp a Pinnacle Emissary, go to cast a 0-drop, and I can respond with Fetch, Fatal Push the Emissary, and potentially shut down an explosive turn on their side. If they're on Kappa Cannoneer, then cards like Shieldred's Edict get a lot more value, as long as you're able to Fatal Push any Mim Knights or Ornithopters or stuff like that sitting around. But these weapons manufacturing lists are a lot higher on non-creature 0-drops. So you see like the EE in the main, the Claws of Gix. So recognizing if your opponent's on weapons manufacturing or just straight Kappa Cannoneer, Thought Monitor-esque cards is important. Weapons manufacturing means you need to try to interact with engineered explosives on the stack. You can't really do much about them getting a Saga for a Claws of Gix, but it is a much slower way for them to win the game compared to an EE just being able to blow up all their munitions at once. The big takeaways pre-board, regardless of the build, is whether or not my opponent has got Aether Spellbomb and Pithing Needle in the main. I think Pithing Needle, for the most part, is kind of stock. I don't think Aether Spellbomb is as stock. Like you see right here, this one's got a Pithing Needle, but no Aether Spellbomb. This one's got both. So I would... sorry. This one's got no Aether Spellbomb or Pithing Needle. So I would keep an eye on those two things for sure. The reason being, if they don't have Aether Spellbomb, you're a lot more free to discard cards into Frog aggressively to try to get the game over with, or grow a Murktide aggressively again to try to get the game over with. If they are on Spellbomb, that becomes a lot more of a liability, especially if they already have an Urza Saga down and it's just like a matter of time before they go and get the Spellbomb. As far as Pithing Needle is concerned, it's mostly about the turn that they are able to sacrifice the Urza Saga to search for an artifact. You want to make sure you do any discards or any fetching before that resolves in case they get Pithing Needle. But if they don't have Pithing Needle or Aether Spellbomb, like a list like what we see right here, it becomes much more of a race scenario. Like, I want to get a Frog down, a Murktide down, whatever. grow things as fast as possible, get my opponent dead as fast as possible, because they don't really have a way to interact with what I'm doing. Post board against Affinity, we already expect them to have Pithing Needle, Aether Spellbomb, but if they don't have Aether Spellbomb anywhere in the main, then again, just kind of becomes a race. Keeping an eye on Blood Moon effects post board. Those are definitely difficult to deal with a fast Mox Opal start and Urza's Saga. So need to be aware if they have Blood Moon, which I think is kind of stock at this point. Go a little more standardized of a list. Force of Negation is a good card to know about. Emery is really good to know about. Don't really care about Grafdigger's Cage, Galv Blast. Yeah, mostly just Emery, Force of Negation, Blood Moon are like the big things out of the sideboard. Our post board game is almost entirely centered around something like Pest Control or Wrath of Skies if you're on Goryos or Blink. Resolving one of those is priority number one. So mulliganing to try to find something to that effect, or being able to cantrip pretty heavily in your opener to find one is a big deal. Tamiyo Flip is really, really good against the Pinnacle Emissary tokens, as long as you can answer like a Kappa Cannoneer. The problem is Tamiyo also gets taken out by Pest Control. So a lot of times against Affinity, I'm like boarding out 2 Tamiyo, boarding in 3 Pest Control. And if I see Tamiyo with Pest Control in the same hand, I'll try to wait until after I Pest Control to get the Tamiyo down. Hands that have Thoughtseize and Pest Control are pretty ideal. Being able to Thoughtseize away a Metallic Rebuke or Force Negation or something like that to make sure that your Pest Control resolves is a very significant line. Obviously, you can't guarantee that, but it does give you something to kind of aim for. Like any of your threats are secondary in the matchup. You kind of want to draw into your threats and have your interaction in hand in the main, because that turn 2 frog is not doing you a lot of good against an army of drone tokens and like an Urza's Saga making 7/7s or whatever. So you need to kind of keep that plan on the back burner until you're able to make sure you're not dead or dying. If you have cards like Dress Down in the sideboard, they're really good at taking out Saga constructs. There's a little song and dance that goes on with Engineered Explosives and Urza's Saga. So if your opponent has an Urza's Saga and they are taking it up to chapter 3, let's say they've already made a construct, they're taking Urza's Saga up to chapter 3, there's 3 options really that can happen. Your opponent can make a construct, at which point after they finish making the construct, you should probably sacrifice your Engineered Explosives right then. You don't want them to search out a Pithing Needle, name EE. If they float mana, you can sacrifice the Engineered Explosives after they float mana, because they have to declare that before they finish resolving anything. So while they have priority, which means you're going to get priority as well. I know that floating mana doesn't use the stack, but they have to make that action before passing priority to you on the Urza Saga trigger. So after they float mana and they pass priority to you, you can sacrifice the EE there. You will have some opponents that will just say, all right, am I going to let this, or is this going to resolve? And if you crack EE first, then they get priority back and can make a construct after EE resolves. Honestly, that's kind of okay, because it means the construct is probably like a 3/3, 4/4, something like that, which is a lot better than like an 8/8. So keep an eye on that. A couple other little things to be aware of: weapons manufacturing. the tokens that manufacturing makes say when it leaves the battlefield, it deals 2 damage. It doesn't matter if you EE them away, if you pest control, if you Hercules recall, any of those all trigger them to deal 2 damage to a target. So there's not a safe way to deal with the board once weapons manufacturing is off or is online, is like making tokens. So the best thing you can do at that point is like fight over engineered explosives on the stack. Maybe consider consigned to memory on an Urza Saga triggered chapter 3 so that you can stop them from getting a Claws of Gix. But it's more going to revolve around having something like Force Negation to interact with weapons manufacturing on the stack. You might have to leave Spell Snare in post board, regardless of not wanting to. Typically, I tried not to. I try to focus on like Hand Disruption, Force Negation to answer weapons manufacturing. But sometimes the hand doesn't work out that way. You just got to keep an eye on what the plan is. From our side, like outside of pest control, Metallic Rebuke is a very annoying card. So bringing in Mystical Dispute to help fight like Metallic Rebuke, Kappa Cannoneer, Emery is really significant. I do not bring in Stern Scolding just for Emery. If I see that they're on like 4 Thought Monitor in the main plus some number of Emery, I might bring in Stern Scolding. But if it's just for like a couple Emery, I'm not. EE, Pest Control, Mystical Dispute. I usually bring in like 2 to 3 copies of Consigned to Memory, especially on the play. Hitting chapter 2 on Urza Saga is a really big deal to stop them from making constructs, but you can also hit things like a hard cast EE with the weapons manufacturing out. You can hit the search off Saga if you don't want your opponent getting a Pithing Needle or Shadow Spear. I've hit the ETB artifact ETB trigger off Kappa Cannoneer to stop them from making it unblockable for a turn. There's a few random little uses there. You just kind of have to recognize like this is an awful matchup, so you need a little bit of cheese to get lucky. For 5, we've got Eldrazi Tron. I'll start by saying that I think the colorless builds of Eldrazi Tron are significantly better for us than like the green builds. Obviously they've got a lot of good cards, but something like Harbinger of the Seas does a much better job against these builds than against some of the others. Let's see. Sorry, sip of coffee. Some of the pre-board things that I'm looking for in a list like this, they've got Dismember in the main. That's a really good one to keep an eye out for. How many copies of like Devourer of Destiny, Ugin Eye of the Storms are they running? Is this a situation where I need to like mulligan to a hand that's got Thoughtseize into Frog and then just throw everything extra into that Frog and hope it gets there? Game 1, with the sheer number of cast triggers and us not having Consigned to Memory in the main, for most of us not having it in the main, means that game 1 is going to require a good bit of cheese. So keeping hands that can like interact with a cast trigger Eldrazi through Hand Disruption, or keeping a hand with Force Negation for a map, something to that effect. Getting a quick clock down, just trying to see if you can possibly get away with a game 1 win, but kind of unlikely. Games 2 and 3, though, are a whole different animal. Consigned to Memory is a heck of a magic card against these archetypes. So having access to Consigned to fight over Devourer and Ugin. If you have something like Flusterstorm, I've been on the fence about it, but I think I would recommend bringing it in here. they're likely to just tap out completely for Kozilek's command, so you can fight over that. A lot of times you can fight over like an All Is Dust the turn they cast it. So it's got some amount of targets, but Kozilek's command is definitely the big one. Just being able to deal with that card for 1 mana without needing a consign to memory. Disruptor Flute is a card that's become extremely popular, and I think a lot of times Tron players name the wrong thing with Disruptor Flute, just kind of like flash it out there and name something they think is relevant at that moment. Like, oh, it's turn 2. They name Psychic Frogs. They don't want you to play a Psychic Frog. And you're just like sitting on Counterspell, Consign to Memory or something. Or sitting on a Harbinger. So a lot of times I'm not spending a Counterspell on Disruptor Flute unless my hand is set up in a way that I have like my best cards. Like if I have Frog and double Consign to Memory, and the only way that I'm losing this game is if I don't get to cast my spells, then I'm fighting over Disruptor Flute. But if I'm sitting there with like Frog and Consign, Force, Harbinger, Thoughtseize, something like that, I might let the Disruptor Flute resolve, because even if they disrupt part of my plan, I still have a very good secondary option that can get me there or buy me the time I need to get my cards cast through Disruptor Flute. Not really much else to say about game 1. Game 2 definitely becomes like a lot more of a race scenario. You need to get a threat down. You need to start attacking. Keep an eye on like how many copies of Dismember your opponent's got in their 75. I think 2 to 3 is kind of normal. I don't think I've seen anybody running the full 4, unlike Amulet Titan. So it's a little bit easier to get a Frog or a Harbinger down. The best cards for us out of the board, Harbinger of the Seas, Consign to Memory, are like the hands down options. If you do find yourself in a scenario where you're expecting a lot of Eldrazi, it might be worth going with like a couple copies of Spreading Seas. I found that card has worked extremely well for me. So just an extra little option you have available there. Yeah, most of their sideboarding is just like Karn targets. So if Karn gets kept off the battlefield, then you really don't have to worry about a lot of these cards. It's just Disruptor, Flute, Dismember, the 2 big things. So on to number 6. This is Domain Zoo. Definitely a matchup that is a lot more difficult to prepare for, because kind of like us, they're just a good mid-range deck. And it's really difficult to hate out a deck that's like just doing fair things consistently. But some things I want to keep an eye out for game 1 especially. Do they have access to the Doorkeeper Thrall? So I want to know if there's a chance that they're going to have like my in-step Doorkeeper Thrall, untap, Arena Flage or something like that. And if I can afford to not let that line play out, I want to take whatever precautions to stop that. I want to keep an eye on cards like Quantum Riddler in the main. I've been seeing that show up a lot more recently. Let's see if I can find, a list like this with 4 Quantum Riddler in the main, 4 Consign to Memory in the main, cutting down on things like Fable of the Mirror Breaker. But if my opponent's got Quantum Riddler in the main, I need to be aware of Riddler Consign lines to keep that around. So it means I might want to counterspell the Riddler instead of waiting to let it go to warp, because if I don't counterspell the Riddler and they potentially like replicate Consign on the warp trigger, then I don't have a way of getting that Riddler off the battlefield. But if I counter the Riddler itself, then that Consign to Memory is just like a dead card in hand, because we don't have cast triggers going on. So looking for whether they're Quantum Riddler or not, main board is the big thing. The game plan, game one especially, if they have Leyline Scion, it's not the end of the world. We do have like Psychic Frogs, potentially Murktides or Quantum Riddlers of our own that can outgrow the Scion. So at that point, it's all about keeping the rest of the board clear. Don't let them develop more on top of the Scion. But if we can get down like a frog or something early, you can always throw cards into the frog, jump, block the Scion. Also, there's going to be a lot of times that if you have a frog early, you can attack into a Scion because they're probably not going to block if they're afraid that you're just going to throw away a couple cards and kill their Scion. Post board, Mystical Dispute is about the only card I ever see out of Zoo sideboards that I care about. Everything else is like geared towards Affinity and Tron and stuff like that. So just keep an eye out for if they have Mystical Dispute mana available, if it's something that you absolutely have to resolve in that spot. Cards like Tamiyo are not very great here. Tamiyo, Force Negation, I think, are two of the weaker cards. Their biggest non-creature threats is Leyline Binding, and it being flash means they can play around Force Negation pretty easy. Mystical Dispute, obviously very good card, but there's going to be plenty of times that they're not able to hold up blue mana. Either they don't have it available to them, they don't have a ley line out, but because a lot of their lands are like green, white, or red, there's a reasonable chance that they're going to have to use like a Steam Vents for casting a Flage or a Kavu or Ragavan or whatever, and not have that blue up to Mystical Dispute. So just try to keep an eye on your windows of when you can resolve something without worrying about them having a counter back. Kavu, not the biggest deal. Flage, if you have like Strategic Betrayal out of the board, this is a huge Strategic Betrayal matchup. Was being able to take out like a Quantum Riddler or Scion and exile the yard. So Flage isn't an issue. Is kind of a two birds with one stone scenario. And then keeping an eye on the number of Stubborn Denials they have in the 75. Like this list has got 3. I think one of the lists I saw earlier only has 2, or 2 main, 2 sideboard. They might bring in the extra ones, but knowing how many stubs they have available means you know how likely it is for them to have one at any point, and you can choose to play around that if you would like. Either they don't have a threat out and you have the extra mana available, or you decide if the spell you have is worth like using a bait spell for, or risking the stub. 7, Amulet Titan. So Amulet Titan has introduced a new little wrinkle here with Ice Till Explorer. It's definitely a good card. I don't think it like swings the matchup that much. It's already been the case that if you're up against Amulet Titan and they get like multiple Urza sagas going, you're going to have a rough time. If they're making constructs off their Urza sagas, you're going to have a rough time. So like them adding more Urza sagas after that has happened isn't really changing things. Like you were already pretty behind there. It doesn't change the fact that like our game plan almost entirely revolves around flyers. So Psychic Frog, Murktide Regent, Quantum Riddler, if you can get it down fast, whatever. But being able to attack over construct tokens, Ice Till, Aftermath Analyst, any of that stuff. Subtlety, definitely the best game or best card pre-board. Things I want to keep an eye on game 1 are like, in this case, Malevolent Rumble is a really good card to know about. Scape Shift is pretty stock, but Rumble being able to potentially set up Shifting Woodlands early means I need to kind of foot on the gas, get the game over with. Arboreal Grazer usually gets most of my fatal pushes because I feel like if I can take Arboreal Grazer out of the equation and guarantee that my frogs and Murktides are getting damage in, then I can draw into counter spells, use those for Murktides, Ice Tills. If you have something like Stern Scolding in the main, using that pretty aggressively just to get the blocker out of the way is nice. I want to pay attention to if they have Green Sun Zenith. Again, I think that card's becoming more and more stock with the addition of Ice Till Explorer, but it is a way for them to play around something like Subtlety. So knowing that that card is available might influence my decision to, like, if I have a Subtlety and I need to discard something, I might want to not discard the Force of Negation if I know they have Green Sun Zenith and Malevolent Rumble. Whereas if they don't have Green Suns and Rumble, I'm probably discarding the Force pretty aggressively. Post board, Bajuka Bog can be pretty good. Cavern of Souls, Otawara, any of those that I can see post board might swing things. I have noticed that a lot of times their post board game plan gets a lot more susceptible to pest control. So for like the list we see here, this is from the Pro Tour Edge of Eternities. They've got Elvish Reclaimer coming in from the board, Vexing Baubles coming in. We already know they really want to go in on Urza's Saga in the matchup. So pest control being able to wipe up like Constructs, Elvish Reclaimer, Vexing Baubles, all those is very, very significant. So if you've got access to pest control, I would definitely bring it in. Dismember is the other pain card. Like, it can make it really awkward to get an early Harbinger down. So I would try to save your Harbinger for a turn after like a Thoughtseize, or a turn you can play out Harbinger and hold up Counterspell, or test the waters with like a Tameo or something early that they want to dismember. Try to get that card out of hand before you get to your actual Harbinger. Stern Scolding gets a lot better against them with the addition of Ice Till Explorer. So we see like an Ice Till in the main, another Ice Till in the board, Tireless Tracker in the board, Elvish Reclaimer in the board, Arboreal Grazer and Aftermath Analyst in the main. Bunch of good Stern Scolding targets. I would not Stern Scolding like an Arboreal Grazer on turn one, but if they find like an Amulet or two, go for a bounce land, and then go for a Grazer, I would probably Stern Scolding the Grazer then. Unless your hand is just like stocked full of subtleties and counter spells and whatnot. Vexing Bauble usually doesn't matter that much. It can be a little bit annoying. Grave Hate, if you've got like Strategic Betrayal, that's pretty good for taking out a Construct token or taking out an Ice Till or something and exiling the yard. Less good if your opponent's got Arboreal Grazer out at that moment. So try to set it up with like attacking into Grazer or Fatal Pushing Grazer or something, and then Strategic Betrayal. Surgical Extraction's pretty good if you got that one. But for the most part against Amulet, like the straightforward Frog, Murktide, Thoughtseize, Counterspell, Subtlety plan, it's typically good enough to win a good number of games against them. If they do go for like a Dismember on an early Frog, I'm probably aggressively discarding to save the Frog, because again, Frog clocks plus draws more relevant interaction, and that's all I really want in the game. Next up, we've got Prowess. Good old Prowess. And keep Corey Steelcutter off the board. That's like priority number 1, 2, 3, and 4. Is if you keep Corey Steelcutter off the board, the matchup goes from like 20% to 70% just in that one instance. Slick Shot Show Off, like the ways you die against Prowess are Corey Steelcutter and an explosive like sandbag turn. So a turn that they just go Slick Shot, bolt, double bolt your blocker, lava dart you, flashback lava dart, mutagenic violent urge, or like something insane like that from a slick shot. Um, Otherwise, Corey Steelcutter just making an extra body every single turn will usually get there. So try to save interaction for Corey Steel if you can afford to. If your opponent's like really low on resources and you've got a sizable clock, like a good sized frog or a Murktide out or something like that, then you might let the Corey Steel resolve and save your interaction for lightning bolts. But for the most part, Corey Steelcutter is going to be the thing that you want to look for. Pre-game or pre-board, I'm looking for stuff like looking at Violent Urge, seeing if they've got any like Unholy Heats in the main deck. Usually don't, but it's worth keeping an eye out for. Not too much to look for. Like Prowess is pretty stock game 1. Game 2 and 3, however, Unholy Heat is the card to look out for. You know they're probably bringing in 4 copies. So being able to incidentally interact with the graveyard with stuff like Strategic Betrayal is really, really significant. Or like Cling to Dust to take them off Delirium a little bit. Nihil Spellbomb is a good one to bring in since it does cycle and take out the yard. Murktide Regent, or I've seen Abhorrent Oculus out of Prowess list is like a sideboard juke. So Mystical Dispute coming in is surprisingly good. Allows you to fight over Expressive Iteration more aggressively. Murktide and Oculus, you can fight over opposing spell snares and spell pierces. I do want to keep an eye on what counters my opponent's bringing in. Like we see this list on 1 spell pierce, 2 spell snare. I've seen lists with like 3 pierce and no snares. I've seen lists with 3 snares and no pierces. So knowing what your opponent has the ability to counter at any point is good. Like if I know they're not on spell snare, I'm more likely to jam a frog early. If I know they're on spell snare and not spell pierce, then I feel a little bit safer about like interacting on low mana, fatal pushing with like 1 or 2 mana, trying to set up those scenarios where I can double spell more aggressively without worrying about them interacting back. Yeah, post board. Tamio is a big liability. Kaito's pretty rough. Pest control's really good out of us. If you have like engineered explosives, that's coming in. It's also one of the few ways to interact with a Corey Steelcutter that's already resolved. If you do have EE, if you have something like Prismatic Ending, that's definitely good out of the board or out of the main. What else? Mystical Dispute mentioned can come in. Kind of about it, really. Like game 1, you're trying to get a big frog or a Murktide down, something they can't kill with lightning bolts and lava darts very easily, and then try to tempo out the game. Post board, you want to take care of threats as aggressively as you can. So like get channelers and Swift Spears show offs off the board, counter Corey Steelcutters. Eventually you'll kind of run them out of threats. The problem is once you run them out of threats, you still need to win the game. And that's where Unholy Heat can be very, very difficult. So if you can afford to run them out of threats and then take out the graveyard, even if it's just like Strategic Betrayal you have no creatures on board, but just exile your yard and then cast my Murktide or my frog or whatever, it's probably worth it. Or like Spellbomb, just go ahead and crack it and then get a threat down just to try to make sure my threat can't easily be dispatched. See, go over a couple of these lists. Oh, Into the Flood Maw is a really, really annoying one. I've seen this card coming out of Prowess several times. It's such a good answer to a big Murktide Regent. So keep an eye post board if they have access to Into the Flood Maw, because it might mean that I can't just like aggressively play out a Murktide if I don't know what my opponent's hand contains or if I don't have an answer to it. It's definitely not in every list card, but it's prevalent enough that you need to be aware of it. Next up is Neobrand. Neobrand's a pretty good matchup. I know that they can have like nut draws that you can't do much about. So for example, if they've got a Neo form on 2 with double packed backup, you're probably not going to be able to beat that. But this is very similar to the Belcher matchup where like a card advantage engine on turn 1 or 2 is absolutely king. Being able to draw more counter spells than your opponent over the course of the game, because they're going to have draws where they naturally hit like Xenagoses and Gultas and Gristlebrand's, Atraxas, whatever, that aren't doing anything for them in hand. They need to hit like a critical mass of summoners or of pact negations and Veil of Summers. And so if you're able to fight over like 2 of those, then you should be fairly okay. Obviously that's a lot easier than it sounds, but it's something that you kind of get a feel for. We're definitely aggressively mulliganing for like a Tamiyo or Thoughtseize into Frog game 1. You just need to be able to get that card draw engine down in the battlefield. There's not really much I'm looking out for game 1. Most of their decks a fairly known quantity. You know what they're doing. They know what you're doing. It's just who puts their game plan forth better. Watch out for Veil of Summer game 1. So if you can afford to like not cast, if you're on the draw and your opponent plays Fetch Land Go or like Shock In Breeding Pool Go, don't just fire off the Thoughtseize and give them the opportunity to tempo you out of the game. Try to wait until you can either protect that Thoughtseize or maybe stop an opponent on a turn, untap Thoughtseize. The post-board games are a little more difficult. So like this Pro Tour list right here, Hope of Gearper out of the sideboard can be pretty difficult. If you've got something like Strategic Betrayal, it's a little bit better of a bring in than like Fatal Push, because Fatal Push is going to hit absolutely nothing outside of Hope of Gearper. Strategic Betrayal can hit Hope as well as stuff like Hooting Mandrills or an Allosaurus Rider without a Neo form. Or if they are able to get a Neo form out, then Strategic Betrayal can hit Atraxa, Gristlebrand. If they hit Gulta, you're probably dead, but can take out some of those big derpy threats, get them off the board. So your Edict effects are a lot better post board than your Fatal Pushes. But if you see that your opponent's got access to 4 copies of Hope of Gearper, you're probably leaving in a couple Fatal Pushes because you kind of have to. Hope of Gearper also says that you can only sack it to prevent the casting of spells from an opponent that was dealt damage by Hope of Gearper. So we do have things like Tamiyo and Psychic Frog that can stand in front of Hope of Gearper really, really well, or like Murktide. Kaito, Stun Down are all really good. It is legendary, so you don't have to worry about multiples of them. So we naturally do have a lot of ways to interact with Hope of Gearper, but it is one to be aware of in case you have an uncertain slot, like you're considering boarding out that 4th Thoughtseize. You see that your opponent's got 4 Hope of Gearper, might be worth just leaving in an extra answer to it. Into the Flood Maw is good. Dismember is good. Mystical Dispute, obviously really good out of them. For the most part, if we can stick a card advantage engine early, not worry about Hope of Gearper, then we'll win the counter battle. They just kind of have like significantly more dead cards than us, especially post board, where they're drawing like extra Neo forms and evolutions and stuff like that. And we're drawing Counterspell, Mystical Dispute, Force of Negation, Consign to Memory is one that I would definitely bring in. So consigned to memory serves a couple pretty funny purposes. I don't usually bring in all four, but like two, maybe three, depending on the configuration. So the first is ETB triggers. So Atraxa ETB, Galta ETB, Xenagos combat trigger, stuff like that. You can consign to memory and kind of survive a turn, especially if you have a strategic betrayal or Shieldred's Edict or something. The funnier use of consigned to memory, though, is if your opponent's got a like Pact of Negation or Summoner's Pact, whatever, for Allosaurus Rider. They go for Neoform. You go to counter. They Pact of Negation. You counter back. They Veil. You counter that. You win this counter war, and then play your turn, pass back to them. Now they've got these pacts to pay for. And usually the best way for them to pay for the pact is to replicate a consigned to memory targeting all of their packs. You can consign the replicate trigger on their consign. So if they have multiple packs to pay for, you replicate consign targeting their replicate trigger. You can make it so they only get one copy of consign. They can counter like a pack trigger, other one resolves, they lose the game. So it's a fun little card to have access to post board that not everybody sees coming or knows like how to interact with, or they just can't interact with. Just make sure if you get in that scenario, try to replicate the consign on their replicate trigger, because you don't want to just cast consign and have them like mystical dispute you or play another Summoner's Pact to counter your consign. They could have Veil of Summer, but if they didn't use it on their last turn and they're using it to stop themselves from dying, that's kind of a win in our books. Neobrand. Got Esper Blink. The big game one takeaway from Esper Blink is, are they on Solitude or are they on Subtlety? Like for us, we would much rather see Subtlety, because you can sneak threats down in front of Subtlety, especially like a good Murktide Regent, and they probably can't get it off the board after that. So knowing that they're on Subtlety, thought seizing that away, getting down a Murktide is a really good way to sneak away with a win in game one. You do have to obviously be aware of things like Felia that can blink Murktide, or Quantum Riddler standing in the way. Taking note of Teferi counts in the main is really significant. Knowing if they're on Consign or Ephemerate. Like this build is on more Consigns than Ephemerates. I would love to see this, because there's plenty of times that you can counterspell the Quantum Riddler itself, leaving the Consign as effectively a dead card for a bit. But recognizing if they're Solitude or Subtlety, how many copies of Teferi, more Ephemerates or Consigns are like the big takeaway pre-game or pre-board. Post-board, it's Oust Teferi. I think are like the only things. Emperor Bones coming in, but Oust Teferi are the big ones. Some people will bring in Clarion Conqueror. I don't think it's that particularly good. Mystical Dispute. Like a lot of these normal blue, black, X sideboard cards you've seen from other matchups. Mystical Dispute being a big one. Teferi being a big one. So knowing how many copies of Teferi post board. If you're running copies of Teferi, this is a really, really, really good matchup for it. Stopping like Subtlety altogether shuts down a huge part of their engine. We've got some cards like Cavero, or I think this is what the Spider-Man the Amazing Spider. I don't remember which one it is. One of the Spider-Mans. So keep an eye out for that in paper because the name might be a little bit different. You don't really have a lot of great ways to play around this card outside of counter spells, but Strategic Betrayal to keep the yard clear is pretty nice. I'm not entirely sure why they would play this card without Solitude, but who knows? People make decisions all the time. Pending count post board is good to know about, but I think like Pending and Oust are pretty interchangeable. They're going to have some number of one of them, so just be ready for that. Mystical Dispute's kind of the big one, but we've already talked about Mystical Dispute matchups ad nauseum. Force Negation doesn't really matter against us. We're interacting on their turn, not our turn, so Force a lot of the time is going to be dead. Subtlety obviously is a lot better. O-Masters is good to know about. It's another matchup that like Kaito really shines if you have access to that. Teferi's really good. Like I said, Murktide Regent is a lot better against these non-Solitude builds, so just keep an eye out for which variation they're on. This is like number 10, 11, something like that. Blue-White Control. So this is the Orm's Chant, Isochron Scepter, Prison style deck of the format. For the most part, the games against Blue-White Control revolve almost entirely around Planeswalkers being able to interact with like Teferi on the stack, Narset on the stack. Means a lot of their cards are a lot less exciting. Definitely Kaito is your MVP in the matchup. If you can, what's the most politically correct way to say it? If you can resolve a Kaito and stop your opponent from resolving a Teferi, then the matchup is fairly close to a bye. You've actually got more counter magic than they do, and relevant counter magic to the matchup. Kaito just cannot be taken off the board outside of like Celestial Purge post board. But if they can Teferi Supreme Verdict, that's a way to get Kaito off the board. So Ninjutsuing Kaito gets around like all the counter magic, and stopping Teferi means they can't verdict it away. And all you got to do, or all you got to worry about at that point, is like Isochron Scepter and Narset Days Undoing. So it just limits the amount of things your opponent can really do to interact with you. Thoughtseize is fantastic. The only things I'm really keeping an eye on pre-game or pre-board are like card advantage counts. So keeping up with like consult the star charts, stock up in this case. I don't really know why they're on one stock up and two consults in this list, but that's kind of cool. If they have something like Galvanic Discharge pre-game, that's good to know about. But I'm pretty sure these like blue-white splash red lists aren't running Galvanic Discharge. But you will see some Jeskai lists similar to this that might be running. This is kind of all over the place, isn't it? Elia, Ragavan, Quantum Riddler. No counter spells. So definitely treat that matchup. Like the Flage matchups get treated a little bit differently because Flage is a relevant card out of them. But not having Narset, Days Undoing, Isochron Scepter means that they are a little clunkier in my mind, because like Escaping Flage, sorcery speed's a lot more interactable. Against these Jeskai style opponents, the Kaito plan is a little bit worse because Flage, ETB, and Galvanic Discharge give some extra ways of interacting. So trying to tick up Kaito a lot more aggressively is nice. try to get it out of range of like double bolt effectively. Unless you can just find like 2 or 3 counter spells. Post board against blue-white control. Post board against blue-white control. Mystical Dispute is a big deal. Celestial Purge is a big deal. I've had them bring in Disruptor Flute against me. I don't think it's that good out of them, but I kind of understand like why they're bringing it in. Really, it's just Celestial Purge and Mystical Dispute are the only things you care about. So making sure that you take those efficient counters with Hand Disruption. It's like if you take away the Mystical Disputes and their ways of interacting for a mana advantage against you, then their deck becomes extremely top heavy. Like 8 copies of 3-drop Planeswalkers in a world where we're playing Force of Negation and Counterspell, Mystical Dispute, means that we'll be able to win those counter wars pretty effectively as long as we kind of interrupt their ability to stabilize in the counter war. We don't want them to have Teferi plus Mystical Dispute plus Spell Snare, for example. Winning the counter war post board, looking out for cards like Celestial Purge, and trying to keep hands with like Hand Disruption into Frog, Hand Disruption into Kaito. A lot of times, if you're able to get, say, a Frog down on turn 2 and your opponent goes for a Prismatic Ending, it's worth just forcing that aggressively, getting the Frog hit in, and then trying to find an answer to like a Narset or Teferi. You have like enough of them in the deck that the odds are fairly good. And if they want to Prismatic Ending, you force, they Solitude, pitch white card, they're probably like out of resources at that point. And hopefully your next threat will be able to take it down. Let's see, Ruby Storm. I have a really good matchup guide against Ruby Storm on the YouTube already. You should be able to search like Ruby Storm matchup guide or something and find it. But I did a lot of work breaking it down from the Dimir perspective of like how to keep an eye on what mana your opponent has available, how to interact, what you want to do at what points, when to jam, when not to jam, what to worry about. So the deck, for the most part, hasn't changed a lot since then. So I'll leave that up there. The post board options, I think, are where it differs pretty greatly. A lot of cards in the board are going to be wish targets. So you see things like Stormscale Scion, Empty the Warrens, Gideon of the Trials. Stuff like this is usually not going to be something you care about because you're going to be interacting with like the wish itself and not so concerned about what they get off of the wish. But it can be useful to know what kind of silver bullets they have access to, so that there's going to be a number of times you could just let the wish resolve if you want them to spend more mana on something else. So like if they wish and they've got 2 mana available and you look at their sideboard and you're like, all right, well, they've got Grape Shot or Ultimate Untimely Malfunction here, something like that. Or they've got Voice of Victory. I know these are the options available to them. I can decide if it's worth letting them resolve one of those or going for the counterspell on the wish. Voice of Victory is not one I've seen a whole lot out of Storm, but that's a kind of cool card post board, I guess. I think most of the time this is about normal, like Orum's Chant, Prismatic Ending. Sometimes it's the Static Prison instead, but some sort of interactive spell in Orum's Chant, which means that post board it becomes even more crucial to interact with the mana advantage, or the mana reducers if you can, because you don't want to set up an opportunity where your opponent can Orum's Chant and go off for the mana reducer. So fighting over those is big. Sometimes they will Orum's Chant to try to resolve a mana reducer. So like Orum's Chant with 2 mana left over to go for a Ruby Medallion. If you have like a Force of Negation, I would just use it on the Orum's Chant, because there's two reasons. One, if you don't use it on the Orum's Chant, you're not going to get to use it at all. But there's also the chance that they won't go for the follow-up, because they might think that, oh, he's got the Force Negation for the chant. If I play my follow-up and he's got another Force Negation, I might just lose on the spot for not having a mana reducer. So it's worth at least making that choice in their side. All right, so this is Riot. I think it's called Riot Spider. Can't remember what the name is. The Spider-Man names are throwing me off. Krauser the Swarm is one. So this is a new Spider-Man card that basically gives the uncounterable text to all of your spells. We should still have some number of fatal pushes in post board, so you can interact with this. You can also counter this on the stack. It does not stop itself from being countered. So things like Stern Scolding post board, Spell Snare, Counterspell can interact with it on the stack. Or if you fatal push it in response, it doesn't give your spells uncounterable. It says as a static line of text, they can't be countered. So if they put another spell in the stack and you respond with fatal push this, then you can counter their spell. They no longer have that spells can't be countered text. Orum's Chant pending. Riot Dude. Empty the Warrens comes up like once in a blue moon, but us being a Psychic Frog Murktide deck, it's a little less relevant. So we can potentially just fly over. But I would definitely recommend going to check out that deck guide if you're really concerned about the Storm matchup. I'm very proud of it. I think that it has a lot of awesome information. So this is Grixis Reanimator. I think Grixis Reanimator for the most part is just like worse Goryos. Like your Goryos, but all of your spells are sorcery speed, and that changes up how you could play the game pretty drastically. You have to become like this all-in Thoughtseize deck to try to protect your reanimate spells. From our side, like obviously Sticking a Frog is nice. They are a 4 fatal push deck. Thoughtseize to try to strand some big payoffs in hand without a way to get them in the yard. Same as Goryos, like countering Frog is a lot more effective than letting it resolve and trying to kill it, because you don't want them discarding an Oculus or an Archon that they can unearth or persist respectively right away. Emperor of Bones is a nightmare of a card. There is a cool interaction that's really nice to be aware of. If your opponent's got an Emperor of Bones, like let's say they have Emperor, a couple mana available, they go to combat and target something with the Emperor of Bones ability. And this is very, very important to remember in paper. They target something with Emperor. If you respond to the target with like Fatal Push on the Emperor itself, the Emperor dies. That card in the graveyard gets exiled. Do not fall into the trap, or I say the trap. Do not fall into a situation where your opponent targets like an Archon with Emperor. You kill the Emperor and then they don't exile the Archon out of their yard. And I don't think it's a malicious thing. I think it's just like a not paying attention thing, but that Archon or whatever they target should be exiled, even though the ability has not finished resolving yet. It's not a May ability. The card, if they target something, the card is gone. So keep an eye on that. What else? Pre-board, there's not really anything too crazy. Like I said, I think they're Goryos, but like worse Goryos pre-board. The one advantage is Oculus is absolutely hard castable, and the card can run away with games. So if you have the chance to like strategic betrayal kind of early just to get like a Archon out of the yard, Oculus out of the yard, or stop an Oculus from being cast, it's probably worth it. The other thing would be for Shieldred's Edict, the Oculus token, the manifest, or I gotta word myself correctly. The manifest card is not a token. So if you Shieldred's Edict and name, say, I want you to sacrifice a non-token creature, your opponent can sacrifice the manifest token instead of the actual Oculus. So make sure if you've got Shieldred's Edict, you're like interacting on their end step if you can, or with the Oculus trigger on the stack on your upkeep if you don't have the mana available. You do not want the Oculus trigger to resolve and then Shieldred's Edict. But Strategic Betrayal is like best card you have against them. Cling to Dust is really good. Post board, they have a little bit of interaction and bringing in this case, like some mystical disputes. They might have some spell pierces. This list has Force of Despair, Into the Flood Maw. Very, very minimal interaction. So it's kind of more on us to bring in like extra copies of Strategic Betrayal, or if you've got access to like Nihil Spellbomb, that's going to be a good one. The what's it called? The mystical disputes out of the board are really, really good as well. 100% need to be bringing those in. They're good at dealing with Psychic Frog, Hardcast Oculus. A list like this has got Kavero, so keeping an eye on something like that. But mystical dispute out of the board to fight over Frog and Oculus, and then fight over their counters, trying to fight over what you're countering. Really, really important. Other than that, yeah, just try to keep the same mindset as you do against Goryos. Force of Negation is a whole lot better against these Reanimate decks than it is against Goryos, since Goryos is instant speed, where these are all sorcery speed. So I would try to keep in Force Negations if possible. Dogfather. Okay. Let me start by saying, and I'm sure I'm going to get some flack because I am actually going to be seeing a lot of Control for Days over the course of the Houston trip. So I'm sure somebody from that group is going to flame me for what I'm about to say. I do not think these hybrid Broodscale Yawgmoth lists are very good. For the most part, I think that they take like the worst halves of two different archetypes, try to jam them together, and it is not better than the sum of its parts. And I'll elaborate a little bit on why I think that. And it could also just be because of the deck that we play. So they take things like the Young Wolf, Yawgmoth, Agatha Soul Cauldron core from the Yawgmoth deck and try to jam it with like Broodscale, Urza's Saga, Blade of the Blood Chief from Broodscale decks. The problem is they lose Court of Calling from the Yawg Shell. They lose more access to Yawgmoth itself. They lose more access to Grist. And then from the Broodscale side, they're losing Flesh Raker. They're losing Kozilek's Command. Like all of these really, really good cards. They're losing Cavern of Souls.
So it just becomes a lot clunkier against a deck like ours. I'm sure there's reasons to go this route. I don't know what they are. And I'm sure I'm going to regret it because I'm probably going to run into the deck like 7 times this weekend and lose all of them. But I personally don't see the draw to these builds, but obviously I'll have plenty of time to hash it out with them and find out what the reasoning is. That being said, fighting over the deck is a lot more about just picking off key targets as you can. So, for example, I want to be able to kill Basking Broodscale before they're able to equip a Blade of the Blood Chief somewhere. They don't really have any ways of interacting with me killing Basking Broodscale. Whereas like Yawgmoth could have Veil of Summers and could have Chord of Callings in response and stuff like that. This deck doesn't really get those things. Keeping Agatha's Soul Cauldron off the board is nice. They're really like a Soul Cauldron Wolf Walking Ballistic combo deck. That's like what their entire deck is centered around. So being able to keep Soul Cauldron off the board stops that combo and gives them just a bunch of individually like fairly low power level cards. Grist is still a really big deal, but they can't Chord of Calling for Grist, so you know that the Grist is coming. Keeping Delighted Halfling off the board means you can still counter the Grist and the Yawgmoth and stuff like that. So I would try to keep Delighted Halfling off the board, keep Agatha's Soul Cauldron off the board, and then Frog and Murktide should be able to do their thing for the most part. Post board, they've got Fatal Pushes coming in. They've got Assassin's Trophies potentially, Endurance. I think post board is just going to be about trying to get down a Murktide as soon as possible. Frog's a little more susceptible to interaction, but getting down Murktide especially is a really good way to clock your opponent very quickly and keep Yawgmoth off the board. So we're bringing in stuff like Pest Control is really good for sweeping away some of the halflings, Grist tokens, Blade of the Blood Chief, Saga constructs. You can bring in Harbinger of the Seas, because if you're able to interact with like Delighted Halfling, Harbinger could shut them off some number of basics, can stop them from making constructs. Their mana base is a little bit greedy. These Abzan ones, I'll talk about this one a brief second. I realize that Samwise is not the same strategy, but just talking about like creature-based combo decks in Modern. For Samwise, it's keep Birthing Ritual off the board. That's like 99% of the battle. Keep Birthing Ritual off the board and try to make sure they never have 2 combo pieces sticking around. So if you don't know the combo, it's Samwise Gamgee, Cauldron Familiar, and a sack outlet. Samwise triggers to make a food whenever a creature enters the battlefield. So Cauldron Familiar entering makes a food. You have a sack outlet to sack the Cauldron Familiar. Then use the food that you created to bring the Cauldron Familiar back from the graveyard. Trigger the Samwise Gamgee again. Make a food. Sack the Cauldron Familiar. Repeat the loop, and it drains you for life every time that the Cauldron Familiar enters. If you're able to keep them from having 2 combo pieces out on the board at one time, it makes it a lot easier to not set yourself up to just die to like a Chord of Calling randomly. If you keep Birthing Ritual off the board, they become a very fair, just value green white black creature deck. The problem is their value is not very valuable, since a lot of their hard cast creatures are like Cauldron Familiars, Gilded Gooses, Young Wolves, stuff like that. And then they have a couple one-ofs that are fairly clunky to hard cast, so having access to like Stern Scolding, Counterspell, and that stuff post board. Chord of Calling is a big one to keep an eye out for. You never want your opponent to have the ability to Court of Calling for a Grist. So managing mana early with Fatal Push on things like Gilded Goose, or not tapping out in a spot where Court of Calling for Grist could be backbreaking. Post board, Path to Exile, Assassin's Trophy, Fatal Push, a lot of the same interaction that the green-black Broodscale deck has. They might have something like Voice of Resurgence. I've seen that card a few times here and there from Samwise. Kind of a cool, techie card. But again, if you're following that same pattern of flyers are king, Murktide is better than Frog, getting down some sort of evasive threat and getting the clock going is usually a pretty good path to victory. And then last but not least, let's go over Mill. Zeriak would be proud that I'm including Mill on the list here. Very, very narrowly made the list. So game one against Mill, keep crabs off the board if you can. For the most part, like if your opening hand has a Murktide, that's fantastic. Frog is also fantastic, but you need to have one of those threats down. Frog being able to exile stuff from the yard to stop surgical extraction main deck is really nice. Also limits the ability of Visions of Beyond to become a draw 3. So Frog down, Murktide, because if you can get a Murktide down in like turn 2 is a fairly big threat. They usually don't have a lot of ways to deal with it outside of Milieu for a whole lot, and then drown in the lock to kill the Murktide. But that slow piecing together of getting cards in your yard and then drown gives you time to untap, regain your mana, interact. Post board, not really much going on. More specifically, it's just going to be extra removal spells. You might see, I haven't seen Mystical Dispute out of them, but that's kind of cool. I've definitely never seen them bring in Psychic Frog. That's kind of dope. But for the most part, it's just going to be extra interactive pieces. You do want to keep note of if your opponent's gotten Snaring Bridge out of the board. That can absolutely be a way for them to steal a game. So keeping an eye out for Ensnaring Bridge, and then keeping an eye out for what kind of removal spells they're bringing in. Yeah, like I think Zeriak's lists are a pretty good way of gauging. So you see like Feed the Cycle, Baleful Mastery, just extra removal coming in out of the board. None of the other stuff really care about. Extirpate, just Surgical 5 through 7. Be careful if you see Extirpate and you've got Psychic Frog out on the battlefield, you cannot respond to Extirpate with exiling to Psychic Frog. So if you have the opportunity to proactively exile stuff with Psychic Frog that you do not want to get surgical, I would do it. So for example, if I've got 10 cards in my yard and it's my opponent's turn, and I've got a Psychic Frog, I might just respond to the first thing that they have access to. Like, let's say I pass the turn to them and they go to draw. I might just say something like, actually, in your upkeep, I'm going to exile this counter spell, this Murktide, and like this Force of Negation or whatever to fly the frog. Just because having those cards in the yard doesn't really matter, and it stops my opponent from being able to go, all right, main phase, extirpate, target, whatever, and I can't respond to that. So just proactively exiling if they've got access to extirpate. Otherwise, Mystical Dispute's a fantastic card post board. If you have Flusterstorm's really, really good. Mulling for Frog or for Murktide. What I do not recommend is boarding up to like 70 cards. And the reason I don't recommend that is it makes you far less consistent at enacting the game plan you want. Like if you can find a Murktide or a Frog, you have a really good shot of winning the game anyway by shutting off like Drown in the Lock, Surgical Extraction, Visions of Beyond, a lot of this stuff. But if you board up to like 70 cards, you have less chance of seeing a Frog or a Murktide, and you end up clunking up your deck with a bunch of things that are dead draws as the game goes on. Mill is more of like a combo control deck than they are an aggro deck like Burn, especially nowadays. So being able to interact efficiently, consistently, effectively, I think gives you a better chance at winning the game than trying to like add in 10 more cards and then not be able to see your mana as much as you want, or not be able to see the threats you want to see or the interactive pieces you want to see because you have all this extra stuff. Now, if you want to board up to like 64 or something, I can't stop you there. But again, it's not really like my preferred avenue. I would rather be the most consistent anti-control deck that I can be than worry about trying to overboard. But that's all I got there. Hopefully this gives you a pretty good breakdown of how to approach some of these matchups. Gave some sideboarding tips, gave some things to look out for pre-board, post-board, in open deck list. If you have any questions, any concerns, feel free to leave a comment on the video. I would love to hear everything that you've got to say. Try to answer as much as I can before this weekend, because I know people are finalizing deck lists, trying to make those last minute decisions. So maybe this swayed your mind on a couple cards here and there and made some of those decisions a little bit easier. But other than that, I'll have links down below, like I said, to my most recent trophy list, which was literally last night. I'll have links to the Discord, to the Twitch channel. So if you're wanting to come check out some live streams or come discuss things in the Discord, we'll have links down below for that. As always, if you're enjoying the content, enjoying the commentary, feel free to leave a like on the video. Consider a comment to help out the algorithm. Always appreciate it. Other than that, hope you all have a fantastic rest of your day. Stay safe. Enjoy some good food and company. I will catch y'all back live later. And if you're going to be in Houston, come say hey. Love to meet you. Love to chat all things Frog. So yeah, other than that, adios for now.